A former U.S. Marine was driving home after a long night shift at his auto garage, expecting nothing more than silence and snow. But on a frozen bridge, in the middle of a blizzard, he noticed an elderly woman digging through trash with trembling hands. What began as a simple decision to stop would pull him back into a past he thought was buried forever. The truth she carried would expose a betrayal, restore lost honor, and force him to choose between safety and justice. This is not just a story about survival. It's a story about faith, sacrifice, and the quiet miracles God places in our path. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story moves you, subscribe so you never miss another story of courage, redemption, and hope. Winter had sealed the city in ice, the kind of cold that crept under skin and settled deep in the bones. Snow fell steadily as Jack Miller drove through the empty streets, the headlights of his old pickup carving narrow tunnels of light through the darkness. It was past midnight, long after the city had gone quiet, and the industrial blocks near the river looked abandoned beneath layers of white. Jack sat tall behind the wheel, broad-shouldered, his posture still carrying the discipline of a man who had once worn a uniform every day of his life. At 42, his face was weathered and angular, with a squared jaw, short-cropped dark hair threaded with gray at the temples, and a permanent crease between his brows that never quite softened. A trimmed beard shadowed his cheeks, not out of style, but neglect. He had learned not to care much about appearances since leaving the Marines. Beside him in the passenger seat sat Rex, a 7-year-old German shepherd with a sable coat darkened along the spine, amber eyes alert even in stillness. Rex was large, muscular without bulk, his movements economical and controlled, the way military dogs were trained to move. A faint scar cut through the fur near his left ear, a souvenir from a deployment neither of them spoke about anymore. Rex's ears were forward, his body calm but attentive, as if the world might demand action at any second. Jack trusted Rex's instincts more than his own. The dog had saved his life once. That kind of loyalty never faded. Jack had just finished another double shift at the auto garage where he worked, a place that smelled of oil, rust, and burned metal. He liked the work because machines made sense. People didn't. Cars broke for clear reasons, and when you fixed the problem, they ran again. Human beings were messier. After leaving the Marines, under circumstances he never explained to anyone, Jack had learned to keep to himself. No family, no close friends, no attachments beyond the dog at his side. The silence suited him, or at least it kept the memories quiet. As he slowed near an old apartment complex behind a deserted parking lot, Rex suddenly stiffened. His head lifted, ears fully erect, a low vibration rumbling in his chest. Jack's foot eased off the gas. "What is it, buddy?" he murmured, though Rex's gaze was already fixed on something beyond the reach of the headlights. Jack followed the line of the dog's focus and saw movement near a cluster of dumpsters half buried in snow. At first he thought it might be an animal, a raccoon maybe. But then the shape straightened, unsteady, painfully slow. It was a person. Jack parked and stepped out into the cold, pulling his jacket tighter around his solid frame. The wind cut across the lot, sharp and relentless. Under the weak glow of a flickering security light stood an elderly woman, no taller than Jack's shoulder, her back bent slightly as she leaned over an open trash bin. Her hands were bare, thin, red and trembling as they sifted through discarded containers and soggy cardboard. She wore a threadbare wool coat several sizes too big, once navy blue but now faded to gray, its cuffs frayed, its buttons mismatched. Wisps of silver-gray hair escaped from beneath a knit hat pulled low over her forehead. Her face was narrow, deeply lined, her skin pale and drawn tight over high cheekbones. She looked older than 65, the way hardship aged people beyond the calendar. Jack stopped a few steps away. His instincts warred with each other. Walk away. Don't get involved. That had been his rule for years. But something about the way the woman moved, slow, cautious, almost apologetic, made his chest tighten. Rex stepped forward before Jack could stop him, then halted abruptly, standing rigid at Jack's side. The dog did not bark, did not lunge. He simply watched. The woman flinched when she noticed them, clutching a plastic container to her chest as if it were a shield. Her eyes, a faded blue clouded with exhaustion, darted from Jack to Rex and back again. Fear was there, sharp and immediate. "I'm not here to hurt you," Jack said, keeping his voice low and steady. Years in the Marines had taught him how much tone mattered. "Just checking if you're okay." She didn't answer. Her breath came out in short, uneven puffs. When she shifted her weight, something slipped from inside her coat and fell into the snow with a dull clink. A small metal object attached to a worn chain. Rex reacted instantly. At the sound of the metal striking the ground and the woman's startled whisper, "Easy, easy, stay down," Rex sat sharply, back straight, eyes forward, as if responding to a command he hadn't heard in years. The movement was precise, automatic. Jack froze. The woman stared at the dog, realization flickering across her face, followed by something deeper. Recognition. Or regret. Jack bent slowly, picking up the object from the snow. It was an old military-style necklace, scratched and dulled with age. Not a decoration, something that had been carried for a long time. "Ma'am," Jack said carefully, his pulse beginning to quicken. "Where did you learn to say that?" The woman swallowed hard, her gaze dropping to the ground. Her voice, when she spoke, was thin but unmistakably deliberate. "I didn't mean to," she said. Old habits don't die easily. Rex remained seated, unmoving, eyes locked on her. Jack straightened, the cold suddenly forgotten. In that moment, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. This was not a coincidence. And whatever had led this woman to dig through garbage in the middle of a frozen night was tangled with a past that refused to stay buried. Jack broke the silence first by setting the engine to idle, the truck's heater breathing lukewarm air into the cab while the snow continued to fall outside. He unwrapped the food he'd brought from the garage, leftover stew in a dented metal container, still warm from the microwave, and held it out carefully, as if offering it might shatter something fragile. The woman hesitated, eyes flicking to Rex, then to Jack's hands. Up close, Jack could see how thin she was beneath the oversized coat, her shoulders narrow, posture slightly folded inward, as if she'd learned to take up as little space as possible. Her face bore the quiet dignity of someone who had once been proud, lines etched by years of work rather than age alone. When she finally accepted the container, her fingers trembled so badly, Jack worried she might drop it. She ate slowly, deliberately, spoonful by spoonful, never lifting her gaze. Halfway through, she paused and slid a portion into a folded napkin, tucking it inside the inner pocket of her coat with practiced care. Jack noticed the gesture and felt a familiar tightness in his chest. The recognition of a survival instinct forms not by habit, but by sudden loss. People who had lived on the streets long enough didn't do that. People who had just fallen did. "My name's Evelyn," she said at last, voice soft but controlled. "Evelyn Carter." The name sounded ordinary, the kind that blended easily into a crowd. Her accent was local, educated, not the drawl or slur Jack expected from someone who'd spent years drifting. "I'm not homeless," she added quickly, as if the word itself offended her. "I'm just having a rough stretch." Jack nodded, not pressing. He'd learned long ago that pushing only made people retreat further. "Shelter's open a few blocks from here," he said gently. "They've got beds, hot showers." Her jaw tightened. "No," she said at once. Too fast, too firm. "I can't go there." Rex shifted,
resting his chin on his paws, eyes never leaving Evelyn. The dog's presence seemed to unsettle her more than Jack's. She kept glancing at the harness around Rex's chest, at the scars half hidden beneath his fur, as if trying to place something she almost remembered. Jack studied her in silence. Fear lived behind her eyes, but it wasn't the panicked fear of hunger or cold. It was deeper, calculated. The kind that came from being watched once too often. "You don't owe me explanations," he said. "I just don't want you freezing out here." Evelyn laughed quietly, a sound without humor. "Freezing isn't the worst thing," she said. "Cold passes." "Other things don't." Jack felt the weight of those words settle between them. He glanced at the darkened buildings around the lot, at the windows that reflected nothing but falling snow. He remembered nights like this overseas, when the quiet itself felt like a threat. "You got somewhere safe tonight?" he asked. She nodded, though the movement was small. "There's a basement 2 blocks over, broken window. I can get in if I need to." The way she said it, matter-of-fact, unashamed, made Jack's stomach turn. He ran a hand over his beard, frustration building. He wasn't trained for this kind of mission. Fixing engines? Yes. Breaking down doors? Yes. Convincing a frightened woman to trust him? That was another matter entirely. "At least let me drive you closer," he offered. Out of the wind. Evelyn stiffened, eyes darting past him into the darkness. For a second, Jack thought she might bolt. Then she shook her head slowly. "If I disappear into a shelter," she said, voice barely above a whisper, "someone will notice. Paperwork gets filed. Names get logged." Jack frowned. "You think someone's looking for you?" Her hands clenched in her coat. "I know they are." The heater hummed softly. Rex's ears twitched as if he sensed the shift in the air. Jack felt a familiar pull in his gut, the old Marine instinct that told him this wasn't paranoia. "Who?" he asked. Evelyn swallowed. The word came out broken, almost unwilling. "People who don't like loose ends." The sentence hung there, heavy and unfinished. Jack thought of the necklace, of the way Rex had responded to a phrase that shouldn't have meant anything to a stranger. He thought of the years he'd spent convincing himself that the past stayed buried if you never dug too deep. "I'm not trying to trap you," he said quietly. "You can walk away. I won't stop you." She looked at him then, really looked. Jack saw himself reflected in her gaze, a man shaped by something that had taken more than it gave back. His eyes were steady but tired, the kind of tired that came from carrying weight alone for too long. Maybe she saw that he wasn't hunting her. Maybe she saw that he understood what it meant to live with your back against a wall. "I appreciate the food," she said, handing the empty container back. "But you shouldn't be seen with me." Jack took it, fingers brushing hers. Her skin was icy. "Seen by who?" For a moment she didn't answer. Then the words burst out, sharp with fear she could no longer hold down. "If they know I'm still alive," she said, voice cracking, "they won't leave me alone." Rex lifted his head, alert again. Jack's breath caught as the meaning settled in. Alive implied something else, something official, something final that had already been written. Snow continued to fall, quiet and relentless, as Jack realized he hadn't just crossed paths with a woman in need. He'd stepped into the margins of a story that someone, somewhere, had worked very hard to erase. The blizzard arrived faster than the forecast had promised, turning the streets into white corridors and forcing Jack to abandon the idea of driving Evelyn anywhere else. He guided the truck into the fenced lot behind his old garage, a low concrete building with peeling paint and a metal door that groaned when he pushed it open. Inside, the air smelled of oil and cold steel. Jack flipped on a hanging work light, its yellow glow revealing rows of tool chests,
a hydraulic lift, and a space heater humming unevenly in the corner. It wasn't comfortable, but it was shelter. Evelyn stood just inside the doorway, arms wrapped around herself, eyes scanning the room like someone measuring exits before allowing herself to breathe. Jack moved with quiet efficiency, the same controlled economy he'd learned years ago. He set the heater closer, laid an old blanket over a folding chair, and poured hot water from a thermos into a chipped mug. Rex settled near the door, body angled protectively toward Evelyn, amber eyes watchful. The dog's age showed in the silver creeping around his muzzle, but not in his posture. He was still all muscle and focus, 7 years old and seasoned by things that didn't leave visible scars. Evelyn accepted the mug with a nod. In the light, Jack could see more clearly now, the faint yellowing in the whites of her eyes, the tremor she tried to hide by gripping the cup too tightly. The way her breathing hitched when the heater sputtered as if loud noises unsettled her. "You didn't have to do this," she said, though her tone lacked conviction. Jack shrugged. Weather made the call. He leaned against a workbench, arms crossed, keeping a respectful distance. The silence stretched, thick but not hostile. He noticed how Evelyn's gaze kept drifting back to Rex, lingering on the harness straps, the worn metal clip, the disciplined stillness of the dog's sit. Finally, she spoke. "He's military," she said softly. Not a question. Jack didn't answer right away. He glanced at Rex, who remained steady, ears flicking once. "Yeah," Jack said. "So was I." Evelyn's eyes lifted to him then, sharper despite the fatigue. She studied him the way professionals did, taking in the squared shoulders, the careful spacing between himself and others, the way he positioned his body slightly sideways rather than head-on. "Marines," she said, almost to herself. "You don't unlearn that stance." Jack felt something tighten behind his ribs. "You're observant." "I had to be," Evelyn replied. "I was a nurse." "Civilian. Worked alongside veterans for years." She paused, fingers tracing a faint line on the mug. "Trauma teaches you how people carry themselves. Pain changes posture." Jack shifted his weight. He hadn't planned on talking about any of this. But the storm raged outside, and the garage felt sealed off from the rest of the world. "What kind of work?" he asked. "Field hospitals? Rehab wards?" Her voice steadied as she spoke, as if memory gave her something solid to hold on to. Men who came back with bodies intact and minds in pieces. Others who lost more than limbs. She glanced at Rex again. Dogs, too. Handlers and canine units. You learn the bond quickly. It's different. Cleaner. Jack nodded once. He remembered. He also remembered the night that bond had nearly cost him everything. Evelyn's gaze returned to Jack, curiosity edging into caution. "Which unit?" she asked. Jack hesitated. Names had power. He'd learned that the hard way. Still, something in her expression, anxiety laced with recognition, made him answer. 2nd Battalion. Recon. The mug slipped from Evelyn's hands and clattered onto the concrete, spilling water across the floor. She stared at the puddle as if it might swallow her whole. For a moment, Jack thought she might faint. "Evelyn?" he said, stepping forward. She raised a hand, palm out, stopping him. Her face had gone pale, lips pressed tight. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no." Jack's heart began to pound. "You know it," he said. It wasn't a question. She closed her eyes. When she opened them again, they were wet, glassy with something that looked like guilt. "I knew men from that unit," she said slowly. "I read their files. I signed papers." Jack felt the garage tilt. "What kind of papers?" Evelyn swallowed. "Medical clearances, transfers, deaths." The word fell heavy between them.
Rex rose smoothly to his feet, sensing the shift. Jack put a hand on the dog's back, grounding himself in the familiar solidity. "You're saying you were there," he said, "when it happened." Her shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of her. "I was there when the story was written," she replied, "not the truth. The version that made everything easier." Jack's jaw tightened. He saw flashes he'd tried to bury, the evacuation that never came, the radio silence, the official report that labeled what followed as unavoidable. He'd lost men, brothers, and when he came home, the unit dissolved under whispers and blame. Evelyn's voice trembled. "There was one name," she said. "One file I still see when I close my eyes." She met Jack's gaze, fear and resolve colliding. "I signed a death certificate for a man who wasn't dead. I was told it was necessary, that it would prevent something worse." Jack's breath caught. He knew then that whatever had brought Evelyn to a dumpster in the snow had roots deep in the same ground that had swallowed his past. The storm howled outside, rattling the garage door. Inside, the truth settled, cold and undeniable. "And that man," Jack said quietly, "is the reason my unit fell apart." Evelyn nodded, tears finally spilling. "Yes." The heater hummed. Rex stood between them, a silent witness. Jack realized he wasn't just sheltering a frightened woman from the storm. He was standing at the edge of a story that had been buried alive and was now clawing its way back. The storm eased sometime before dawn, but the cold remained, heavy and unmoving, pressed into the concrete walls of the garage like a second skin. Jack hadn't slept. He stood near the workbench with his arms crossed, listening to the faint tick of metal cooling. Watching Evelyn sit beneath the hanging light, her shoulders drawn inward as if she were bracing for a blow that had been delayed for years. Rex lay at Jack's feet, eyes half closed but alert, the way he always was when something felt unfinished. Evelyn took a slow breath. In the thin light, she looked smaller than before, not just fragile from hunger and exhaustion, but diminished by the weight of memory. Her gray hair had come loose from beneath the hat, hanging in uneven strands around a face that once might have been strong and commanding. There was intelligence in her eyes still, and a quiet resolve, but it had been worn thin by fear and time. "You deserve to know the rest," she said. "If you're going to be mixed up in this, you deserve the truth." Jack didn't interrupt. He had learned long ago that some confessions needed space. "I worked as a civilian nurse, attached to a military medical unit," Evelyn continued. "Not frontline combat, but close enough. Triage, evacuation, documentation." She gave a hollow smile. "Paperwork is where the real damage hides. Blood gets washed away. Ink doesn't." She explained how, after the incident involving Jack's unit, she'd been ordered to alter medical reports, to classify injuries differently, to sign off on deaths that had not occurred, or to erase survival that complicated official narratives. The orders hadn't come with guns drawn. They never did. They came with calm voices, sealed envelopes, and phrases like national interest and operational necessity. "When I refused at first," Evelyn said, "they reminded me of my contract, of my age, of how easily a civilian could be replaced." Her hands trembled as she spoke, though her voice stayed measured. "I told myself it was temporary, that I'd fix it later, that I'd gather proof and come back with it when it was safe." She looked up at Jack then, eyes shining with regret. "There's never a safe time." When she finally tried to speak out, the consequences came swiftly and quietly. Her supervisor stopped returning calls. Her security badge stopped working. A notice arrived terminating her contract due to alleged misconduct. The landlord followed soon after, apologetic but firm. Without steady income or references, everything unraveled. "They didn't drag me into an alley," Evelyn said. "They didn't need to. They just erased me."
Her medical license was flagged. Her records vanished from employment databases. Even her credit history became a mess of red lines and denials. She was still alive, but on paper, she barely existed. Jack felt a slow burn rise in his chest. He thought of the years he'd spent blaming himself, replaying decisions, wondering which moment had doomed his unit. "They wrote the ending," he said quietly. "And we lived with it." Evelyn nodded. "Yes." She told him how she'd drifted at first. Cheap motels, borrowed couches, short-term work paid in cash. Pride had kept her going longer than she cared to admit. But pride didn't pay for medication. It didn't hold up when winter came. Eventually, she slipped through cracks she'd once helped patch for others. "The system isn't cruel," she said softly. "It's indifferent. That's worse." Jack looked around the garage, at the tools he kept in meticulous order, at the life he'd built from scrap and routine. He realized how easily it could have been him. One different decision, one missing dog tag. "This wasn't random," he said. "Any of it." "No," Evelyn agreed. "It was designed." The silence that followed felt heavier than the storm outside. Rex shifted suddenly, rising to his feet. His ears pricked forward, body tense. Jack followed the dog's gaze toward the narrow window set high in the garage wall. Outside, beyond the chain-link fence, a dark sedan sat parked along the street. It had been there before. Jack was sure of it now. No lights on. Engine possibly running. Too still to be coincidence. Evelyn noticed the change in Rex instantly. "What is it?" she asked, her voice dropping. Jack didn't answer right away. He stepped closer to the window, careful to stay in shadow. The car hadn't moved in hours. He scanned the street. No pedestrians, no nearby houses awake. "Someone's waiting," he said at last. "Not lost, not broken down." Evelyn's face drained of color. "I told you," she whispered. "I told you they wouldn't leave me alone." Jack felt the old instincts snap fully awake, sharp and undeniable. He placed a steady hand on Rex's collar, grounding both of them. "They don't know what they're dealing with," he said, though he wasn't sure whether he meant himself, the dog, or the truth Evelyn carried. The past hadn't stayed buried. It had followed them into the present, patient and watchful. And for the first time since leaving the Marines, Jack understood that surviving wasn't enough. Some truths, no matter how long ignored, demanded to be faced. Jack didn't argue when he decided to move Evelyn. Decisions like that came quietly, formed not from impulse but from a familiar calculation of risk. The garage was no longer neutral ground, too exposed, too predictable. He drove her to his apartment on the edge of the old industrial district, a third-floor walk-up above a closed bakery, the windows fogged with cold and age. The place was sparse but clean, everything arranged with military precision. One couch, a narrow table, tools lined neatly on a shelf where pictures might have been. Jack himself filled the doorway when he carried Evelyn's bag inside, his broad frame moving carefully so as not to startle her. Rex followed last, nails clicking softly on the worn wood. Posture relaxed only after Jack locked the door. For the first time in days, Evelyn slept without flinching at every sound. Jack watched her from the kitchen doorway, noting the way exhaustion folded her thin body inward, the lines on her face softening when fear loosened its grip. In the daylight, she looked older, her skin pale and fragile, hands marked by years of work and the tremor of untreated strain. Jack brewed coffee, the smell filling the apartment with something close to comfort, and sat beside Rex on the floor, one hand resting on the dog's scarred shoulder. Rex was 7, no longer young, but his senses were sharp. He lifted his head whenever footsteps passed outside, ears angling toward the window, cataloging patterns Jack had learned to trust. The days that followed brought no peace. Jack kept his routine, early mornings at the garage, evenings back home, but he felt the presence long before he could prove it. A sedan parked across the street more than once. A man standing too long at the corner, hands buried in his coat, eyes tracking windows rather than traffic. Not threats. Signals. Whoever they weren't in a hurry. That worried Jack more than open aggression ever could. Evelyn noticed it too. She grew quieter, her movements careful, as if trying to shrink herself out of sight. On the third night, as snow fell heavy and wet, she finally spoke. "They won't come for me directly," she said, sitting at the small table, fingers wrapped around a mug of tea. "Not yet. They'll watch. Wait until I make a mistake." Jack leaned against the counter, arms crossed, jaw set. "You're not making any moves alone," he said. She gave a sad smile. "I already did, by trusting you." That night she told him about the evidence. Not the documents themselves, those were gone from her hands long ago, but the place they'd been hidden. A safety deposit box registered under the name of a lawyer who'd died years earlier. A man with thinning hair and kind eyes who'd once promised to help her do the right thing. The records inside, Evelyn said, detailed altered reports, falsified timelines, orders traced back to a single source. "It's all there," she whispered, "if it's still intact." Jack felt the weight of it settle in his chest. Proof meant danger. It also meant answers he'd carried like shrapnel for years. "We'll get it," he said, carefully. They chose the worst possible time to move, because waiting was no longer an option. The weather forecast warned of another blizzard rolling in by nightfall, and Jack knew storms were good cover, for them and for anyone watching. He packed what little Evelyn owned, checked his truck, and clipped Rex's leash to the worn harness the dog still wore like a badge of honor. The bridge was nearly empty, snow swirling in sheets that erased the city beyond the guardrails. Halfway across, the engine coughed. Jack swore under his breath as the dashboard lights flickered and died. He guided the truck to the shoulder, tires crunching over ice, and tried the ignition again. Nothing. Rex stiffened immediately, ears forward, a low warning sound rising in his throat. Jack followed his gaze through the snow. Headlights appeared at the far end of the bridge, slowing, too slowly. Jack grabbed the emergency kit, his movements efficient despite the cold biting through his gloves. He stepped out, wind tearing at his jacket, and lifted the hood. The engine was dead. Not flooded, not frozen, just dead. A clean stop. Inside the cab, Evelyn watched the approaching lights, her breath coming fast. The fear she'd kept contained for days finally cracked. "I knew it," she whispered. "I knew they'd find us." Jack leaned into the window, his face hard, eyes clear. "Listen to me," he said. "No matter what happens, stay in the truck unless I tell you otherwise." He turned, hand brushing Rex's neck. "Stay sharp," he murmured. A command the dog understood without words. The sedan stopped 100 yards back, lights still on. No one got out. The snow filled the space between them, thick and blinding. Jack felt the familiar hum of adrenaline, the old clarity returning. He realized then that this wasn't just about protection. It was about reckoning. Evelyn's voice broke through the wind. "Jack," she called, tears freezing on her lashes. "There's something you don't know." He looked back at her, framed by the truck's interior light, fragile and brave all at once. "The man I protected back then?" she said, words spilling out now that fear had stripped away caution. "The one whose death I signed? He wasn't just part of the cover-up." She swallowed hard. "He was the one who gave the order." "The order to leave your unit behind." The bridge seemed to tilt beneath Jack's feet. The storm howled, drowning the city,
the past rushing back with brutal clarity. He understood now why this had followed him, why Evelyn had run, why the truth refused to stay buried. The headlights behind them brightened. Rex growled low and steady. Jack closed the hood, his face set, knowing the night had crossed a line it could never retreat from. The power went out just after midnight, the lights flickering once before surrendering to darkness. Outside, the blizzard swallowed the city whole, wind battering the apartment building as if trying to tear it from its foundations. Jack moved on instinct, grabbing a flashlight from the drawer, the beam cutting a narrow path through the room. Rex rose immediately, positioning himself near Evelyn, his body angled protectively, muscles taut beneath his thick winter coat. Evelyn sat hunched at the small table, one hand pressed to her chest. Her breathing had changed, shorter, shallow, uneven. Jack crossed the room in 3 strides, kneeling beside her. Up close, he could see the sheen of sweat on her pale skin despite the cold, the faint blue tint around her lips. She tried to speak, but broke into a harsh cough, the kind that rattled deep in the lungs and left her gasping. Jack remembered the signs she'd shown before, the lingering cough, the way she rationed her pills, the bottle he'd found half empty and long past its expiration date. He cursed himself for not acting sooner. "Easy," he said, voice steady, hands gentle but firm. He guided her to the couch, easing her back, propping her head with a folded blanket. Evelyn was 65, but in that moment she looked far older, her body thin and worn, the strength she'd relied on for decades finally giving way. Jack checked her pulse, irregular but present, and reached for the emergency kit he kept stocked from habit more than hope. Rex hovered close, amber eyes fixed on Evelyn's face, ears twitching at every sound from outside. "I'm sorry," Evelyn whispered, breath hitching. "I didn't want this to happen like this." "Don't talk," Jack said. He crushed the remaining pill from her bottle, mixed it with water, and helped her swallow. His hands were steady, though his mind raced. No power, roads impassable. An ambulance would take too long, if it could get through at all. He did what he could, counting breaths, keeping her warm, watching for signs he'd learned to recognize too well in the field. As the minutes dragged on, the storm seemed to press closer, the world shrinking to the dim circle of light and the sound of Evelyn's labored breathing. Jack felt the old conflict rise inside him, sharp and familiar. He'd lost faith in systems because systems had failed him before, failed his unit, failed the men who never came home, failed him when he needed answers instead of silence. Now the same choice stood in front of him, cruel in its symmetry. Speak the truth and risk Evelyn's life. Stay silent and let everything that broke them repeat itself, unseen and unchallenged. Evelyn stirred, eyes fluttering open. She reached out blindly until her fingers found Jack's sleeve, clutching it with surprising strength. Her hand was cold, bones delicate beneath the skin, but the grip was fierce. "Jack," she said, voice barely more than air. He leaned closer, his face etched with worry and resolve, the lines around his eyes deepened by the light. "You have to listen to me," she continued. "I've lived long enough with this inside me, every night, every face." A tear slid from the corner of her eye, disappearing into her hair. "I don't need more years. I need one thing." Jack swallowed hard. "Don't say it," he murmured, though he already knew. "The truth," Evelyn said. Her fingers tightened around his hand. "I don't need to survive this if it means it stays buried. Promise me." Her breathing faltered, her eyes glazing as the effort drained her. "Promise me you won't let them erase it again." Jack closed his eyes for a brief second, the weight of her words crashing into memories he'd locked away. The night orders stopped coming, the silence on the radio, the report that blamed everyone and no one all at once. He opened his eyes and met her gaze, seeing not just fear, but relief, as if speaking the words had lifted something heavy at last. "I promise," he said quietly. It wasn't a vow made lightly. It was the kind that changed everything that came after. Evelyn's grip loosened. Her eyes closed, her head slumping back against the cushion as she slipped into unconsciousness. Jack checked her pulse again, relief flickering through him when he felt it, weak but steady. Rex let out a low whine, pressing his head against the couch as if trying to anchor her there. Jack sat back on his heels, exhaustion washing over him. The apartment felt smaller now, the walls pressing in with the knowledge of what he'd agreed to do. He looked at Rex, at the dog who'd followed him through war and aftermath alike, whose loyalty had never wavered even when Jack's own certainty had. "Looks like we're not done yet," he murmured. Outside, the storm raged on, but somewhere beneath it all, a decision had been made. Jack knew the danger hadn't passed. It had only shifted shape. Yet for the first time in years, he felt something other than anger or regret guiding him. He felt clarity, the kind that came when the living chose not just to survive, but to stand for something that mattered. The storm broke 3 days later, not all at once, but in hesitant intervals, as if the city itself needed time to believe it was over. Jack stood by the apartment window, watching sunlight reflect off snowbanks that had begun to sag and soften, their sharp edges rounding under the first hint of warmth. The world looked different when the ice loosened its grip. Quieter, exposed. He turned from the window as Rex padded across the floor, tail low but relaxed, the tension that had lived in the dog's shoulders for weeks finally easing. Rex was 7 now, his muzzle graying, his movements slower but deliberate, eyes still bright with purpose. He had learned to wait, to watch, to trust Jack's lead. Evelyn slept in the next room, monitored by a compact medical unit installed by the witness protection team the night before. She looked smaller in the hospital bed they'd brought in, her thin frame swallowed by white sheets, gray hair brushed back from her face. The lines of strain hadn't vanished, but her breathing was steady, and color had returned faintly to her cheeks. She was alive. That mattered. Jack hadn't chosen the pass lightly. The morning after the blackout, he'd contacted an independent veterans advocacy organization, known for handling cases others wouldn't touch. They sent a representative within hours, Marcus Hale, a former Army JAG officer in his early 50s, tall and spare, with close-cropped silver hair and a scar tracing the edge of his jaw. Marcus spoke plainly, listened more than he talked, and carried himself with the calm of a man who had learned that justice moved best when guided carefully. He believed Evelyn immediately. Not because he was naive, but because he recognized the patterns. "This isn't new," Marcus had said quietly. "It's just been buried well." Through Marcus's network, the pieces began to move. Evelyn was transferred under protective custody to a secure medical facility, her testimony recorded in segments so she could rest between sessions. Jack stayed nearby, sleeping in a chair more often than not, Rex stationed at the door like a sentinel. The files were retrieved from the safety deposit box under court order. Thick folders of reports, timestamps, signatures, and alterations that told a story no one had wanted read aloud. Names surfaced, chains of command unraveled. The man Evelyn had protected, the one whose death had been falsely recorded, was revealed not as a casualty, but as the architect of the abandonment that had shattered Jack's unit. The news broke quietly at first, then all at once. Investigations opened, statements were issued. For Jack, the most difficult moment wasn't the public apology or the formal letter clearing his record. It was the phone call from a former squad mate he hadn't spoken to in years, voice cracking as he said, "They finally said it wasn't our fault." The words hit Jack harder than he expected. He sat on the edge of the bed, Rex's head resting against his knee, and let the weight of years lift, just enough to breathe.
Evelyn recovered slowly. She was 65, her body worn by years of stress and neglect, but her spirit, once freed from secrecy, surprised everyone. When she was strong enough, she spoke to Jack in the late afternoons, sunlight pooling across the floor between them. "I thought I'd die invisible," she admitted once, fingers tracing the blanket's edge. "I didn't expect this." She gestured toward the quiet apartment, the dog, the man who had refused to walk away. Jack understood more than he said. He'd spent years believing survival was the same as living. It wasn't. He learned that watching Evelyn regain her voice, listening as Rex slept soundly for the first time in weeks, feeling his own name spoken without accusation attached, these were signs of something returning. Purpose. Belonging. By the end of winter, the snow had retreated to narrow shadows along the sidewalks. Jack cooked dinner in the small kitchen, the scent of soup filling the room. The table was cramped, the chairs mismatched, but it felt like a place meant for people to gather. Evelyn sat wrapped in a light sweater, her posture straighter now, eyes clear. Rex lay beneath the table, paws crossed, content. They ate slowly, savoring the simple ritual. Outside, flakes drifted down again, lighter this time, harmless. Jack looked from Evelyn to Rex and felt a quiet certainty settle in his chest. This wasn't the family he'd imagined once, but it was the one he had chosen, and that had chosen him in return. Winter had taken much from all of them. It had also revealed what endured when the ice finally cracked. Sometimes the miracle does not arrive with thunder or fire from the sky. Sometimes it comes quietly, sent by God through ordinary people who choose not to walk away. Jack did not see an angel that night in the snow, yet God placed a wounded soul in his path and tested his heart. Evelyn did not ask for salvation, but God gave her truth, dignity, and protection through the hands of a man who had lost faith. Perhaps this is how God still works today, not by changing the world all at once, but by changing one decision, one moment, one act of courage. In our daily lives, we never know when God is asking us to stop, to listen, to help, or to stay. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from, or simply write, Amen. Subscribe to the channel for more stories of faith, love, and redemption. May God bless you, protect your family, and guide your steps through every winter you face.